So let's kick this off with our first panel, which is the greatest opportunities for scale. So I'm really thrilled to bring up to this stage Nicole Ceci. She's the principal mechanical engineer for Stephen Winter Associates, a longtime collaborator with Urban Green, and Chris Cayten. Chris is the principal of CodeGreen Solutions, also a longtime collaborator with Urban Green and one of the advisory members for our retrofit market analysis. So Nicole and Chris, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Okay, so I was given the prompt of what should every multifamily building do? And that's a huge question. The multifamily sector in New York City is massive. Over 1 billion square feet of space in our large buildings alone. This is an extremely diverse typology. We have all kinds of people, all kinds of living arrangements, all kinds of buildings. And so figuring out what we should do that applies broadly in this sector, that's a huge ask. That's difficult. So to me, the first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, if we're asking what we need to do to all of these buildings, what's our end goal? What are we talking about? What are we trying to save? And, we're all here because Local Law 97, we're talking about carbon now. But, it's worth remembering that a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we really weren't talking about carbon. For most of my professional career, we've been talking about EUI. We've been fighting about site versus source. And this is a change. And it's important that we all make that change. Carbon's what's important. Carbon's what we care about today. Carbon is the be-all, end-all. And we're talking about carbon coming from, or carbon embedded in a grid that is changing, a grid that's changing drastically. So Local Law 97 has electricity grid carbon coefficients that are a lot cleaner than the coefficients that we're used to. And so it's important that we kind of all make that change to our mindsets. So with that said, what do we do to all of these multifamily buildings? The technical working group several years ago came out and said, well, we need to electrify. We need to ramp up widespread electrification across this sector. We need to electrify over half of our space heating. We need to electrify nearly all of our domestic hot water, and a whole host of other measures as well. And, that's obviously a massive undertaking. And, how do we start? Where do we go first? And to me, the first steps kind of fall into two categories. There are technologies that are available today that we can ramp up, and there are mindsets that need to be changed. So more specifically, if I have the 10 minutes that I have, I obviously can't outline a plan for every single building in the city. But the two big things that jump out to me are electrification of domestic hot water as a technology intervention that we can make today, and heat submetering as a mindset change. So electrification of domestic hot water puts us directly on that technical working group track. They said we need to electrify our hot water. Well, that's something we can start today. You don't need to electrify 100% of a building's domestic hot water in one go. It's something that you can phase in. You can displace some domestic hot water with electricity and then kind of build that capacity over time. It's something that impacts central systems. Residents aren't going to notice. You're not going to have to bother them. You can kind of get in that basement and do the work and get out of there. So that's the technology intervention that we can do today, and we need to start scaling up today. Mindset, heat submetering is a tricky one. We have a mix of residents in New York City. We can't make every resident tomorrow pay for their heating energy, but we can give people control of their heat and really change that paradigm in New York of opening the windows to deal with overheating or residents expecting to be uncomfortable in their homes. So if we start doing that work today where people at least get control of their heat, that kind of puts us on the right track for a future where people are more empowered to kind of reduce the waste in their space. And then, of course, there are other major system overhauls that can happen as systems start reaching their end of useful life, and we definitely have to stop doing business as usual drop-in replacements now. And so the last thing I want to touch on is that we can waste money in two ways. We can waste capital today by doing bad work, those business as usual drop-ins, kind of not looking to the future and just kind of cranking away with what we've always been doing. But we can also waste money on good work. There's plenty of perfectly fine work out there that saves energy, it saves carbon, but it costs a ton of money and it doesn't have a huge savings. Or maybe it costs a ton of money and it doesn't have lasting savings. Our grid's getting cleaner. What does this work mean for that? And so it's important that everybody kind of starts really following comprehensive long-term plans that are aimed at spending capital in targeted ways that are really going to put us on the right track, scaling up that work to reduce our carbon emissions and also putting us on those pathways to achieve 80 by 50. Thank you.
Great, thank you. This is massive over here. It's like all right, hi. Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here speaking to this group. Nicole, as she was asked to look at the multifamily sector, I was asked to look at the commercial office building sector, having worked in this area for a while. So again, I'm glad to be here at Urban Green. I have to admit, I sat 10 years ago with Russell Unger on December 27th of 2009 watching the first set of these bills being passed. So I feel like it's great full circle to come around a whole 10 years later as New York City is taking another step towards carbon reductions in buildings. So happy to be here. Commercial buildings, again, a little bit of context. Wanted to start. This is from the technical working group report that I had the pleasure of helping to create for New York City back in, I think, 2015. Commercial buildings, again, by count, are a small fraction, by area even larger, and then by carbon footprint even greater because their carbon intensities are larger. So they may not be the most buildings in the city, but they have the heaviest carbon intensities. And something that we've talked about a lot is that this is not all the requirements of these bills, even though they fall on landlords. This is something not that landlords can do by themselves. It's true in multifamily. It's even, I would say, even more so in commercial buildings, where so much of these loads are coming from the commercial tenants. And I really think that the only success we're going to see is if landlords and tenants can work together. And ultimately, these buildings are operated for the occupants, not for just for the building or for the landlord. Again, breaking down a little bit of the context. The types of energy that are used in multifamily and commercial are different as well. Electricity being one of the largest user in commercial buildings, mostly because of all the tenant loads, computers, data centers, everything that happens on the plug load side of commercial buildings. So the challenge, of course, is how do you get these buildings to reduce overall? And the way I see it, there are really three ecosystems that right now really work independently. There's the ecosystem of the occupants, their daily activities, when they come to work, what they wear, when they don't come to work, when they work from home. The building systems currently, how they're starting up, how they're turning off, how the leases are structured, and then the grid. And right now, really, these independent ecosystems don't speak. In order to get to the reductions we need, this language really has to be spoken across all these systems. The first is energy efficiency, is what's gained by occupants and building systems communicating, and then carbon efficiency is what's gained by the grid and the building systems communicating. But these things are not directly communicating right now. There's so many layers and barriers that get in between these systems for them to actually successfully communicate. Between occupants and the building systems, again, there's a building owner, there's the tenant organization. There's a lease, essentially, that's governing all these things. Building systems are not run to satisfy comfort. They're not run to satisfy energy efficiency. They're not run to satisfy occupants. They're run to satisfy leases. They're only run to satisfy leases. And again, between the buildings and the grid, again, these systems, other than a few examples I've heard of, are not speaking directly with the grid. They're encumbered by these negotiations and by the contracts that govern them. And again, going through layers from the actual producers through the ISO to the building owner, and then another layer from the building owner back into the system. So these are really insulated systems from each other. Oh, God, I didn't know I did that. Sorry. All right, that was not on purpose. So what will it take? And the way I see it, there are two pieces to this, integration and education, and that's really of all systems. I think we talk about education of people, we talk about behavioral and teaching the people what they need to do. We also have to teach the other pieces of this puzzle as well. And with the overall goal, not just of integrating the adjacent systems of having occupants and building systems working well, but ultimately having all the systems work well and communicate directly with each other. And education essentially is really the main piece of this. Each one of these systems needs to be educated through what I've identified here as a sort of a four-step process of measurement, communication, listening, and then adjusting in a sort of a virtuous cycle. And each of these systems needs to speak, and they all need to listen to each other. And right now, I think that's not necessarily happening, or not happening efficiently, not happening in real time. And it's not, again, just the occupants that need to listen and to learn and adjust. It's all of these systems. So to break it down a little bit before I run out of time, looking at this in each of these three pieces, so building systems are the ones we talk the most about. People talk about IoT, they talk about smart buildings. They're really only one of the pieces of this puzzle. So on the measurement side, there's a lot of interesting work being done looking at more granular data, understanding how to measure both more specific in terms of the systems they're measuring, the tenants and the areas they're measuring, but also granularity and time. Communication, again, this information means nothing if you don't communicate it to folks who can take action with it. So whether or not that's a dashboard or an email or whatever it is, if you're speaking correctly to the right stakeholders, you need to make sure that that information is communicated. And it needs to be actionable. I know the historical, typical way that we communicate, at least to, say, tenants and building owners, is a monthly bill. It includes all of the electricity presumed used by that tenant. Doesn't tell them when, doesn't tell them how, doesn't tell them what system it was. That's really not actionable. Local Law 88, which is on the books for 2025, requiring submetering, is a great step, but a single bill once a month is not going to drive tenants to make improvements. I know Mark Rauch and some group from Mayor's Office of Sustainability, EDF, have been working on better tools to give to landlords to communicate that information to really drive action, and getting closer on real time and near time. Again, this information that's communicated needs to be actionable. It can't be too old or historic. And then the last piece on this, looking at context. Again, in John's remarks this morning, referring to and making comparisons to other things that we are much more familiar with is the only way that it's actually going to hit home. So giving someone a number that says, hey, tenant, you used 10,000 kilowatt hours last month means absolutely nothing to them, like less than nothing to them. So that's something that we need to work on. Sensors, clearly, listening. The building needs to listen better. Needs to input data more efficiently from multiple sources. And then the controls. Again, we understand building controls quite well in terms of more granular adjustments that are made with this data. On the occupant side, I think measurement, we may get there where Fitbits and other types of information are actually measuring the information that are coming from people. Communicating to building operators either passively, just by being in a building, coming and going. There's sensors that are now looking at occupancy, literally hour by hour. And then paying attention, those occupants actually do need to listen to the inputs coming from them, either if it's dashboards or emails or however they're getting that, and then changing their own behavior. There may be days where they say, come in a little bit later, don't work work from home this day, unplug and use your laptop on battery power for this time. So they need to learn. And then the grid is the last piece to really have this all affect not just DUI and energy use. The grid needs to be listening and learning as well. So one thing I know we're pushing for in the rulemaking with Local Law 97 is some idea of time of use carbon intensity, and I think that will be one of the real required pieces for long-term carbon reductions, is allowing buildings to get credit for load shifting throughout the day, as opposed to using one annual carbon emissions factor. And then communicating, I know I'm running out of time, but communicating this information back to building owners and to occupants, and then also being able to predictively make changes in the grid mix will allow this to really come full circle, to have the occupants, the building systems, and the grid working to both learn and adjust so that these reductions can be made. And ultimately, the point really is with this information, with this communication that flows freely across all these three systems, you really do have an ecosystem that's running efficiently where all that information is getting to the hands who can make those adjustments, which requires much more flexibility and ultimately carbon reduction. So Thank you. Thanks for your time. Should I leave that up there like that?
So we have a little bit of time left, and in preparing for this this session, Chris and I had a lot of calls where we'd spend about 5 minutes talking about our slides, and then an hour of debating the finer points back and forth. So we decided to steal these last few minutes here and just kind of continue that conversation, because there are a lot of points that we wanted to keep digging in, and we figured that there's no time like the present. So, Chris, one of the questions I want to ask you, in your presentation, you talk a lot about the need for education in a broad sense of that term. What I didn't hear was we need to rip out a whole bunch of systems, and we need to replace a whole bunch of central components to a building. Can you speak a little bit more about that distinction?
Sure. I mean, my view is that, again, we don't know what the long-term grid coefficients will be, so we don't yet necessarily know where systems or when they should be say, fuel switched from, say, if you have chiller, steam, gas to electric. My view is that there's a lot of reductions that can be made through behavioral, better cycles with understanding when your people are in the building, when are they not in the building, when are tenants there, that if we can get 10, 15% through behavioral and upgrades and essentially what are called kind of commissioning improvements, the ripping out of systems is something that really needs to, in my mind, wait a little bit until we have more clarity on where this law is going to be going. Because for someone in the next, say, 6 months to say, oh, I've got to rip out all my steam chillers, replace them with electric, I can't recommend that yet to somebody. So I think there's a lot of work still needs to be done on getting this feedback loop of energy and information behavior before we start telling them exactly which is. I mean, I would love systems to become more efficient before they make that big capital spend. I mean, I'd be interested on your side, on the multifamily side. Do you think is it I know the systems are quite different sometimes between multifamily and commercial. I mean, do you think in multifamily buildings it's the other way around? Do you think people really do need to be changing central systems immediately?
Yeah. So what's interesting, what I don't think has come up in our conversations until right now, is that there is a huge similarity there when I talk about the need for expanding control, resident control of heating. That is, that's very closely related to what you're talking about. It is a way of making buildings smarter. It's about buildings reacting to the people in them. But, in a residential setting, I think individual occupants having more direct control is probably more important than it might be in a bigger office setting where you can't have 10 people fighting over the same thermostat. So there is definitely some similarity there. I mean, I think that we are a little bit more comfortable making some calls on central systems at this point, like electrification of domestic hot water. But, again, a major central component in my mind is that mindset shift, which does require making buildings a little bit smarter and a little bit more reactive to inhabitants.
In terms of, on follow-up to that, I know you talked a lot about control of heating. There are a lot of buildings, there's some office, but even more multifamily that have no central air conditioning. So in terms of the loads that are coming online, given improvements and higher expectations of tenants, I mean, how do you see the rise in more of either central AC or more window ACs or more people just wanting air conditioning in buildings? How do you see that in comparison to the targets that are being set?
Yeah, air conditioning is a tough one because, there are two sides to it. One is the fact that it does require energy, and we're trying to reduce energy usage. But more importantly, it's a health and safety issue, and it's something that I think that we're getting more information about how a lack of access to cooling is disproportionately affecting low-income communities, elderly residents, people who are vulnerable to really serious health outcomes of not having cooling. So, first and foremost, nobody should ever advocate for saving carbon at the expense of hurting vulnerable people. So, cooling has to happen. It has to be expanded. There are some interesting pilots that NYCHA is doing right now and others where we're trying to figure out if there are ways to use more efficient cooling with good controls and maybe try to break even on the carbon emission side. But first and foremost, health and safety. And then the other piece of that is as our grid gets cleaner, the actual carbon impact of electric cooling becomes a lot smaller anyway. So this kind of might become a moot concern anyway.
I think the other question I had seen was, in commercial office buildings, we're working very much with large operations teams. Sometimes a building could have 5 or 10 folks who are focused on this, day in, day out. Working with multifamily buildings, do you have a sense of, where is this biggest opportunity? You've talked a little bit about the tenants. I mean, how much education is going to be required from, say, superintendents, supers and landlords? A lot of these smaller buildings now, even that this has gone down to 25,000 feet and higher, that opens up a whole new tranche of buildings, which just, at least from my point of view, seem much less sophisticated in terms of attention to these things. I mean, how do you see that, their role in this?
Sure. So, the site staff definitely plays a huge role. We see a very wide range in the field of folks who have had a lot of experience on different building systems, had access to a lot of educational programs, continuing education, things like that, down to folks who are relatively new in the field. I think one of the interesting things that I hear over and over again, especially from contractors and service contractors, is that new equipment is more digitally driven. We're entering an age of boilers with touchscreens on them. And, 50 years ago, everything was done with manual linkages. So, the skills that people working in buildings and maintaining building systems, the skills that those folks need have kind of been evolving from tinkering with a manual piece of equipment to being able to interpret data, to being able to interact with computer and digital interfaces. And that's a change that's happening, partially through education and partially just through younger folks coming up in the system. I think that's a pretty interesting change that we're starting to see people, speak more about in the field.
Yeah, I think on the commercial side, as I said, a lot of the operators are relatively sophisticated at the landlord level, but we've found, again, since tenants are such a big portion of this opportunity and of the solutions, that finding skilled folks within these tenant organizations is really hard. I know we're focusing on it, and there's some other groups. NYSERDA's doing a lot of focus on putting energy efficiency programs in place for tenants, but I do think commercial tenants are going to be a huge, I haven't done the math of what their percentage of the citywide carbon is, but commercial tenants are going to be a huge piece of this, and figuring out how to get them to the table both during new design and also during mid-lease to figure out how to incentivize them to make reductions, whether or not it's saying that the landlord may give them some of the fine if they exceed it, or may they give them some additional money during fit out. But I think getting to commercial tenants and having those sophisticated operators on that side is going to be a really hard piece on the operator side.
Yeah, and I would assume with office buildings, you have this extra layer that we don't have in multifamily. So you might have whoever's managing that tenant space, but then you also have the workers themselves. The people are in the office themselves. So, to the extent that those folks have hands-on responsibility for energy usage in the space, how do you then make that second jump? Owner to manager to actual person interacting with the space.
Yeah, that was a little bit of what I touched on here about that learning process, is building systems and that those messaging. And we're just getting to a point, right, where there's if you're in a big sophisticated building, maybe you have an app from your landlord that tells you about yoga and ice cream and other things like that. Hopefully, those get to a point of actually telling the tenants, hey, like I said, don't wear your suit tomorrow, or we're starting up at this time. Something. Clearly, it can't just be a take from the building owner. It has to be some give back. But I think now, once we're all in this together, those individual tenants, not just that tenant rep, the one person who answers the phone, but it's got to be the individual occupants, are going to have to be part of that feedback loop.
Great. So we just got the signal that we are out of time, although I'm sure we could sit here and chat all day long about this, but that's what everyone else here is going to do.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, everyone.
So efficient.